In 1896, Homer Plessy went to the Supreme Court and established that it was okay for things to be separate, as long as they were equal. Soon after, it was clear that this compromise was poor and could never be equal. These are some pictures of the different cases that helped to desegregate schools in the 50s.
Many people were involved in this change, and it was one of the most important advances to ending inequality in the United States of America.
During the years of 1950 and 1954, along with the following years, there were lots of conflicts and compromises involved with the Brown versus Board of Education cases. But first, let's start at where this separate but equal began.
In 1896, Homer Plessy decided to go on a white person-only train car even though he was a colored man. Because of these actions, he was arrested and brought to court, which eventually made it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that because the train cars were equal, it was okay for them to be separate, and it did not conflict with the 13th Amendment or the 14th Amendment. With a 7-1 vote and one abstainment from the Supreme Court justices, it was ruled against Plessy, and his case failed.
These segregation laws, otherwise known as the Jim Crow laws, continued with no strong argument against them. But eventually the idea to fight back sparked in 1909 when the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, was born. At first they only did small cases for their first 20 years, until they decided to attack the weakest part of the segregation laws, school desegregation. This helped them to grow more and to start taking on more separate but equal cases.
There were 5 cases between the 30s and the 50s that all led up to the Supreme Court cases that happened in Topeka, Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware. The most famous of these 5 cases is the case of Oliver Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. Linda Brown was a 3rd-grade African-American student that wanted to go to an all-white elementary school to avoid a mile walk to her all-black school. But when she got rejected, her father, Oliver Brown, was furious and went to court to help his daughter's civil rights. This case and the 4 other cases that happened eventually all went to the Supreme Court in one big case known as the Brown versus the Board of Education case.
Before we get into the Supreme Court cases, we must talk about the lawyer for these cases and how he has affected civil rights history. His name was Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was born on July 2, 1908, and was raised to become a lawyer and joined the NAACP to fight for civil rights. He once said that his father didn't tell him to become a lawyer, his dad turned him into a lawyer. Little did Thurgood Marshall know was that later on he would become the first black Supreme Court justice in the history of the United States.
On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in the case of Brown versus Board of Education. The court ruled unanimously that racial segregation in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. This decision grew out of several cases that challenged racial segregation in schools across America.
In the case for Brown versus the Board of Education, all of the 9 justices were divided in what they should do. Some were all for desegregation, while others said just give more money to black schools, so it was equal. In short, it was going to be hard to make a decision. In addition, as if things were interesting and controversial enough, the Chief Justice, Fred Vinson, died during the case due to a heart attack and was replaced by the Governor of California, Earl Warren. Once Earl was in, he was able to make every justice sway that they should desegregate. Soon after, they came to court to make the unanimous decision to desegregate schools, and the case was won.
In 1951, I'd used a plain geometry book that had been used by a white student in 1935. Brown said that was over. The hand-me-down tubas that I played in the high school band from the white high schools, it said to me that that was ended. And it said to me that at some point, I would not have to travel from Atlanta to Greencastle in Indiana to get an undergraduate degree. That my family, my cousins, my neighbors could go to Georgia Tech and to the University of Georgia. The Supreme Court decision of 1954 was for me the Magna Carta. It was the second emancipation. It was a great moment.
Now that we know the topic, let's talk about the conflicts and compromises that happened during this case. The most clear conflict was the problem of segregation. Both sides were annoyed at this since black people didn't feel they got the same or equal chance at life, while whites felt everything was fine even if they had a little problem here or there. In addition, there was conflict inside the court of what they should do about the case and how it would affect the USA. In fact, almost all the justices had their own view about it at first. Some thought to make everything equal but separate and stayed segregated to avoid problems and keep black and white away from each other. However, others thought if they integrated schools, it would be hard for everything to be equal. Life would be a little bit better for all.
Of course, almost all conflicts have ended in some way, and most of those with a compromise. One of the main compromises was the fact that the African Americans had to give up their time, sometimes their well-being, and their money, so things would become equal as stated under the 14th Amendment. And the white had to compromise their values of segregation in order to keep the country equal and whole, and to make an advance to the way it is today. In addition, the blacks also had to compromise losing some of their workers since they weren't getting paid. But even those people were leaving. They went through and made sure that the case was won after they had compromised so much.
Now, why would this be of any importance to us today? Without this jumpstart to desegregation, we probably wouldn't have many things integrated or fair. With this case, it started almost every other civil rights act such as Rosa Parks. Their success led to the success of many others. In short, when this case won, it was the jumpstart of the civil rights movement in the 1950s.